Hello class, let's talk about markets. When we analyze markets, one important thing that we must always remember is that markets are basically relationships between consumers and firms. These two entities are always interacting with each other. It is a give and take. These are what we call the market forces. And when we are analyzing a market, these market forces are going to give us our price and our quantity. So let's dive into this example where we're analyzing the market for lattes, which is another way of saying a market for coffee. As we mentioned before, a market has consumers and firms, and their interactions are going to lead to having a price and a quantity. So in this case, we have our consumers being represented by our demand and our firms being represented by our supply. When they interact with each other, they're going to reach a price that we see here. Now, look at the graph. This price of 3 happens at the intersection of supply and demand, which is here. This equilibrium also gives us our quantity, which leads us to our first definition. A market equilibrium is when quantity demanded equals quantity supplied. Graphically, this happens where demand and supply intersect. Now, let's look at the schedule. How can we distinguish our equilibrium if we're looking at a schedule? So we have to go by our definition. Remember that we're looking for a point where quantity demanded equals quantity supplied. If you look at the data represented on the schedule, you will see that this happens here, where my quantity demanded equals my quantity supplied. And this happens at a price of 3. So, based on this market, all lattes, all coffees are going to be $3 each. And there's going to be a quantity of 15 units. We don't necessarily know what those units are. They can be gallons, they can be thousands of gallons, but we do know that the number is 15. So we can just label it as 15 units of coffee, or 15 units of lattes. We often see changes in prices and quantities in markets. For example, you might remember the shortage that we experienced in the market for toilet paper. People were looking for toilet paper at the beginning of the COVID-19 crisis, and for some reason, many stores had shortages. We also experienced the price of gasoline get reduced at the beginning of the COVID-19 crisis. Now, why do these changes in prices and quantities happen? They happen because of the determinants of demand and supply. These are factors that change demand or change supply. And if we change one of these, we're going to see a change in price and quantity in the market. So, we have 3 basic steps to analyze a market. Number 1 says, decide whether the effect shifts supply or demand. To put it plainly, step 1, you will have to decide if this is a supply issue or a demand issue. Step number 2, decide in which direction the curve shifts. So, to put it plainly, you're either going to shift supply or demand to the right if it's an increase in either, or you're going to shift it to the left. And finally, use supply and demand diagram to see how the shift changes the equilibrium price and quantity. So, what we're going to do is figure out what happens to price and what happens to quantity. Let's look at the market for lattes and the example that what we have here on our board. So, the example reads, municipalities set severe restrictions on operating hours for all coffee shops. This is something that you might have experienced in your favorite restaurant or at the gym, where due to the COVID-19 crisis, a lot of cities around the valley made businesses shut down for a limited amount of time. So we have to think, does this shutdown affect the supply of lattes or the demand of lattes? This affects the supply. Why is it the supply? Because in this scenario, nothing is happening to the consumer. The consumer will still want the coffee. The only thing that is happening is that coffee shops are not able to operate as normal. So, this is something that's going to affect supply. Now, we have to decide if supply is going to shift to the right or if it's going to shift to the left. For this step, do you think you have to think about whether there's going to be more lattes or less lattes? So in this case, we're going to have less lattes. So we're going to have a reduction in supply, a decrease in supply. So this will move to the left. So let's go ahead and draw that and see what happens to our equilibrium, price and quantity. So we have supply, which is here, and we're going to shift it to the left. This is now our supply 2. As long as you shift it to the left, you should now see what the new equilibrium is going to look like. We don't have to give specific numbers, even though this graph has its specific numbers. What we just have to do is tell if price is going to increase or decrease, and quantity is going to increase or decrease. So let's go ahead and label our new equilibrium. Our new equilibrium is here, the red dot. So let's analyze what happened to our price. Our original price was 3, and now it's somewhere closer to 4. So we have our price increased. It went up. Now, our original quantity was 15, and now we have a lower quantity. So, our quantity went down. Again, we do not have to focus on giving exact numbers. As long as we can say that the price is going to increase and the quantity will decrease, that is good enough to analyze the market. Let's keep analyzing the market for lattes with these 2 examples. For each example, what I want you to do is follow the steps that we described above. Step 1, is this a supply or demand issue? Step 2, will this shift the curve to the right or to the left? And finally, analyze what happens to the equilibrium price and the quantity. Let's do the first example. In the first example, it's finals week, and students require more coffee and lattes to stay awake and study. This is a phenomenon that we see around university campuses, where students frequent coffee shops more often as they require coffee and a place to study. So, clearly, this will be a demand issue, as these coffee shops will have more customers. Remember that demand is the customers. Next, we can see that demand for coffee or lattes is going to increase. That means that it's going to shift to the right. Remember that anytime you shift to the right, it's an increase. Anytime you shift to the left, it's a decrease. And finally, let's go ahead and draw it to see what's going to happen in this market. If this is my first demand, I will shift it to the right. This is now my new demand number 2. And this is my new equilibrium. Take a moment to analyze what happens to the equilibrium price and quantity. In this case, the price will increase and the quantity will increase. Think about this. Is there any time where you've seen the price of a product increase as well as the quantity during certain seasons? This does not happen just to lattes. It can happen to a lot of products. Depending on the season, if demand increases, you usually see the prices and the quantities increase. Now, let's go to example number 2. Doctors discover that drinking lattes make you more likely to catch COVID-19. Is this a supply issue or a demand issue? This, again, is a demand issue. Why is it demand? Well, for starters, even though this is a silly example, if we discover that a certain activity, drink, or food makes you more likely to catch COVID-19, then logically there will be less demand for that item. Now, many students think this is a supply issue, but we have to remember that just because something is unhealthy for you doesn't mean that producers or firms will stop producing it. Think about beer or tobacco products. We know that many people die directly from consuming these items, and companies still sell them to us. So, the only thing that happens is that demand gets affected, and demand will decrease in this example. So it will shift to the left. So let's go ahead and draw that in to our diagram. If we're starting here for our first demand, this is my second demand. And this is my second equilibrium. You can see that in this example, the price will drop and the quantities will drop. As products get less and less popular, or people stop demanding them, you usually see that prices drop and quantities drop.